So my talk will be concerned with Galen of Pergamon and aspects of his scientific methodology. As you know, for Galen, the question of the correct method of research was of paramount importance. He addressed it on a number of occasions, especially in the early books of his major treatises, like The Method of Medicine, The Simple Drugs, or The Use of Parts. One treatise that deals with method more generally than others is The Doctrines of Hippocrates and Plato. As you also probably know, early in his career, Galen composed a voluminous work dedicated exclusively to methodological issues called On Demonstration. This was not just a theoretical study of the nature of a properly scientific argument, apodeixis, but also a description of the methods by which such an argument may be discovered. The treatise has been lost, but its contents can be partly reconstructed from Greek and Arabic sources, a task that I'm currently pursuing with my esteemed colleague, Pauline Cochet. One question that was discussed in On Demonstration, and that is also, I believe, of some interest for the history of science, is the distinction between strictly demonstrative or scientific arguments on the one hand, and merely persuasive or plausible ones on the other. The word scientific, epistemonikos, carries the load of the notion of episteme, scientific knowledge, inherited from Aristotle and the Stoics, for whom knowing X implies that X cannot be otherwise, or that it is irrefutably true that X. Galen, following Aristotle, is convinced that arguments producing knowledge in this sense can be discovered not only in mathematics and the so-called mixed sciences, but in life sciences as well, including human anatomy and physiology. For example, the question of where in the body resides the ruling faculty of the soul can be, in Galen's view, settled in a strictly scientific or demonstrative manner. Persuasive then translates the word pithanos, derived from peito, to persuade. Some questions, according to Galen, cannot be settled with scientific certainty, but only persuasively, pithanos. Now, it is a historically and philosophically interesting question what the grounds of the persuasiveness of the persuasive arguments are and how they differ from the strictly scientific ones. Is it a difference of degree in which both arguments possess a certain quality, let's say a credence, but scientific arguments have more of that quality than the others? Or are they of completely different kinds? And is the persuasiveness of the persuasive arguments based on the subjective state of mind, or rather on some objective measures like testing? Another question is what role, if any, persuasive arguments play in Galenic science? Are they an indispensable part of scientific research, or in its preliminary state perhaps, or are they merely provisionally substitutes for properly scientific arguments, or are they wholly redundant? I won't be able to answer all these questions in this talk, but I would like to prepare the ground for addressing them by focusing on two examples from Galen's physiological treatises that avowedly employ persuasive arguments and shed some light on their nature and use. So the first example is Galen's discussion in his treatise on Semen 2.6 about the use of the so-called glandular helpers. The precise referent of this name is not entirely certain. It probably includes the seminal vesicles, a pair of glands lying near the root of the penis, posterior to the prostate gland and the fundus of the bladder, whose function, according to modern anatomy, is to contribute certain important fluids to the overall volume of the semen. Galen, however, refers to the helpers as consisting of 4 parts, not 2, which seems to indicate that it includes the prostate, considered as a pair of glands rather than one gland with 2 lobes. For Galen, the use of the 4 helpers, which in a smaller version he also finds in females, is a mystery. Those sufficiently experienced in anatomy to know of their existence at all usually declare that they contain semen. But there is a difference between declaring that something is the case and knowing that it is so. Thus, irrespective of the number and fame of those who make this statement, Galen focuses on what he knows about the issue. Throughout the section, Galen rehearses several arguments he calls persuasive and one demonstrative argument with a negative conclusion. The first persuasive argument, one he ascribes to his opponents, favors the view according to which glandular helpers produce semen, thus having the same use, chreia, in this respect, as the male and female testicles, the female testicles being the ovaries. The argument takes its starting point from the observation that in males, the glandular helpers open into the same place as the spermatic vessels, spermatica angea. By spermatic vessels, Galen probably means the efferent ducts, which carry the semen from the epididymis, a coiled tube and the testicles, to the ejaculatory duct, and to which the seminal vesicles and the prostate are indeed connected. Presumably, when speaking of the same place into which both the spermatic vessels and the glandular helpers open, Galen has either the ejaculatory duct in mind or the prostatic urethra. But if the glandular helpers open into the same place as the spermatic vessels, the reasoning goes, their use is also the same. They supply semen. And I will refer to this as the prevailing opinion. Galen describes this reasoning as persuasive, for it is persuasive to think that channels opening into the same place carry the same use. However, it is equally persuasive to argue, according to Galen, that if the glandular helpers do not open into the same place, then their use is not the same. And whereas it is true that glandular helpers in males open into the same place as the spermatic vessels, in females, they do not. Now, by female seminal vesicles, Galen probably has in mind the parurethral glands. That's at least what de Lacy suggests. Thus, supposing, as Galen does, that we are dealing with the same organ, observations in males and females leads us to two equally persuasive but contrary conclusions about the same thing. Galen describes this state of affairs as the conflict of demonstrations, he katatas apodeixeis mache, and suggests that this conflict and the ensuing aporia made him reconsider the grounds of the prevailing opinion. According to Galen, the prevailing opinion rests on the premise that the channels which open into the same place are made for the sake of the same use. And I will call it the PU premise, the place use premise. We may, following Galen, paraphrase it as follows. For channels in the body, the community of place indicates the community of use, where the word indicates should be read in the sense of entails. If the PU premise is true, then the prevailing opinion about the glandular helpers must be true as well. But is it really? Or is it rather the case that the relation between the two predicates, community of place and community of use, is asymmetrical in the sense that the second entails the first, but not vice versa? Indeed, Galen tells us, once we have recognized the conflicting nature of the evidence, we should consider precisely this option. And I quote here, whether it is necessarily true that channels which open into the same region are built for the same use, or whether the one statement that those made for the same use empty into the same place is true, but the other, that those coming to the same place necessarily contribute to a single use, is not true. Now, there are examples showing that channels which open into the same region are not necessarily built for the same use. For instance, the duct of the bladder, and here I quote, the duct of the bladder that carries the urine opens into the very same duct into which all the four helpers open in males. Unquote. Here, the very same duct is presumably the prostatic urethra, a continuation of the pre-prostatic urethra, which carries urine from the bladder, but also a place into which the semen passes through the seminal vesicles and the prostate before ejaculation. Thus, even though the pre-prostatic urethra opens into the same duct as the seminal vesicles and the prostate, their use is not the same. Galen mentions other places like throat or intestines, where things having different uses enter. For example, in the case of throat, the things entering include food, air, nasal mucus, some cerebral residues, and saliva from glands at the root of the tongue. And in the case of intestines, things coming from the stomach, fluids from the liver, and other fluids from other glands. However, apart from the fact that the PU premise on which the prevailing opinion is based is not necessarily true, the opinion itself is also demonstrably false. So much, at least in Galen's view, follows from rigorous examination of the matter. In an earlier part of the treatise, Galen puts forward a claim based on observation, for example, of pigs, that if the testicles of an animal are excised, the animal loses two things: the power to produce semen and sexual appetite, as well as innate heat and vital strength more generally. This suggests that all these things are produced in the testicles. Now, according to Galen, if semen were additionally produced in the glandular helpers, then sexual appetite would be produced there too. For if the production of semen were not accompanied by the desire to excrete it, the animal, not being driven by this desire, would not use the semen produced by the helpers, and so its production would be useless. But that would violate the fundamental principle of Galen's physiology, which, as he puts it, is a common point on which we all agree, namely that nature does nothing in vain. However, as already mentioned, excising the testicles deprives an animal of all sexual lust, even though its helpers remain intact. This shows that helpers do not arouse sexual desire, and hence, based on the principle that nature does nothing in vain, they do not produce semen either. What else then is the use of the glandular helpers? Galen proposes two options, but emphasizes once again their merely persuasive nature. His starting point is a distinction of two basic uses of glands made by the first-century anatomist Marinus, for whom Galen has an unusually high regard. I quote, "Either they stabilized unsupported vessels where they divide and are in danger of being torn apart in more violent motion, or they are for the generation of fluids capable of moistening the parts that need to be coated by fluid of a viscous nature to keep them from drying out easily and becoming hard to move." The second of these two uses, moistening certain parts with fluids to prevent their drying out, is potentially relevant to the point at issue. For if glands moisten the open space of the mouth and the pharynx and the esophagus, and if they moisten all the intestines, surely it is not at all surprising that some similar aid has been provided for the neck of the bladder to keep it from drying out at some time and becoming hard to move. And of course, it is much more likely, eikos esti, that nature should have provided such an aid for the male sexual organ itself. So this would also explain, in Galen's view, why the glandular helpers are much bigger in males than in females. For the penis lies extended and unenclosed, and the danger that the urethra dries out is much bigger than in the case of the uterus, which is inside the body and, moreover, receives a large amount of fluids from the surrounding parts, as well as from menstrual blood. Another option is that the moistening from the helpers protects the urethra against the mordancy of the urine. It is important to note, however, that neither of these options is derived from the examination of the glandular helpers themselves. It is based on observations regarding other glands. whether reported by earlier anatomists or made by Galen himself. For example, the fact that certain glands produce saliva and discharges into the mouth through visible vessels, or that other glands moisten the whole of the throat to prevent it from drying out, is agreed homologetai by all anatomists, says Galen. Also, that glands perform the same service for the esophagus and intestines is evident in Galen's view. These evident facts, ta enarge, then provide credence, pistis, to the matter at hand. For if the said use can be observed to belong to others, it would not be surprising, udent haumaston, if it also belonged to the one under examination, and it is even likely, eikos, that it does. Yet precisely because they obtain their credence from other things and not from the subject matter itself, Galen insists that these solutions are merely persuasive and not properly scientific. And I quote, perhaps the uses I just mentioned are the true ones. Perhaps someday some truer one may be found. For the reasoning that discovered such uses as these is persuasive, but it is not demonstrative. For Galen, the only properly scientific argument available in this case is the one which proves that glandular helpers do not produce semen. This is surely because it is based on the investigation of the thing with which the argument is concerned. The observation that glandular helpers do not arouse sexual desire in castrated animals, combined with the reasoning according to which the production of semen cannot occur without sexual desire, for otherwise it would be useless, constitute an argument which satisfies Galen's criteria of scientific demonstration. Galen does not rule out that the use of glandular helpers will be discovered one day with the same apodictic certainty. But until it happens, we have to rest content with one negative certainty and a few merely persuasive positive suggestions. Another place where Galen distinguishes persuasive arguments from those he regards as properly scientific is his discussion about the use of breathing in the short treatise dealing with this issue. Galen's starting point is the observation that the shortage of breath results in immediate death in all animals. This leads him to the question of why breath is of such a vital importance for them. Galen reduces various theories proposed by the medical tradition to two main options. Either breathing provides the body with a nourishing or life-giving substance, or it contributes some indispensable quality. Galen favors the view that breathing, with its cooling effect, primarily serves the purpose of maintaining a proper balance of heat in the body. Secondarily, that it also nourishes the psychic pneuma. The argument about pneuma, which is not as elaborated as the argument about heat, is based on the premise that there is indeed psychic pneuma in the brain, that it must be nourished. Galen argues, against specific theories proposed by his predecessors, that this pneuma cannot be nourished by the vapor rising from the blood, nor by the pneuma sent from the heart through the arteries. So, as Hippocrates already knew, it must be nourished directly by the air inhaled through the nostrils. I will leave this argument aside. As far as the moderation of heat is concerned, the reasoning relies partly on observations of the effects of the shortage of breath, and partly on reflections on the purpose of breathing in situations that require its heightened intensity, like hot baths, exercise, fever, etc. Joined with the fact that the cessation of breathing leads to immediate death, and the reasoning according to which this cannot be due to the damage of the overall constitution of the brain or to the evacuation of the pneuma, as both would take much longer, Galen concludes that the only conceivable cause of death in such circumstances is the excess of heat. But if the shortage of breath leads to the excess of heat, then the use of breathing must be to preserve moderate heat in the body. It is refreshing that in this context, Galen professes ignorance about the substance of the soul. That is to say, that substance on which the life of the body ultimately depends. In spite of that, he seems to regard his arguments about the use of breathing sufficiently grounded in observation and sound reasoning to count as demonstrative. Apart from those, however, he also uses an argument to which he attaches an inferior status. The argument comes up in the context of an inquiry of what quality precisely it is whose absence leads to suffocation when an animal stops breathing. There are conflicting opinions about this issue. Some observations suggest that we breathe for the sake of cooling, when, for example, we breathe more deeply while being excessively warm. But others suggest the opposite, namely that we breathe to fan inner heat. These words, cooling, fanning, or strengthening, are used by people, Galen remarks, who have a vague, dreamlike idea of the use of breath as preserving the innate heat, but who are unable to express their own thought in a precise and articulate manner. They are encouraged to use this language, above all, by the phenomena associated with flames, and rightly so, in Galen's view, as the observations of the effect of air on flames are indeed helpful in showing what the conflicting manifestations of breath have in common. The main points of the analogy are the following. When deprived of air, fire vanishes, just as animals perish when deprived of breath. If we could explain this phenomenon, Galen muses, we might be able to find out which quality of breath is useful for innate heat. On the other hand, flames can also be quenched by excessive fanning, whereas moderate fanning increases them. Galen explains this as follows. Flames move in two directions, away from the matter from which they burn and towards that matter. The extreme of the first motion is the dispersion of fire and its separation from its matter, which leads to its destruction. But when it is forced to return back to its source, without the possibility of moving in the opposite direction, it is quenched. Now, hot and cold qualities, Galen believes, have the opposite effect on fire. Whereas hot air encourages the outward motion of flames, cold air presses them back against their source. And since fire needs both motions for its continued existence, it needs to be surrounded by a moderate proportion of both qualities. So, Galen concludes, we can see that it is always due proportion, symmetria, that keeps flames going. Now, according to Galen, this explanation can be transferred to the case at hand. I quote, "It is not unlikely, uk apeikos, that it is thus with the warmth in animals too. For as its matter, whence it is kindled, it has the blood, and it has by nature a principle of motion in either direction, so that of necessity, if one fails, so does the other. And for this same reason, if you cut it off from breathing or from blood, you will at once destroy it." Galen further illustrates the point with the example of an oil lamp. Heart is analogon to the lamp's wick, the blood to the oil, and the lung to the cover of the lamp, which allows the fire to breathe through a hole, but when closed, it immediately quenches the fire by stifling it. In the same way, Galen argues, the lung, when closed, quenches, as in suspension of breathing, but when open and in breathing, maintains the inner heat. Further, observations of ovens show that lack of draft produces an abundance of black smoke and other waste products of the burnt material, which quench the fire unless we open the oven at the side and let fresh air in. In the same way, Galen suggests breathing purges the smoke-like vapors from the blood. Galen concludes that, a quote, "From all these phenomena, it is possible to accept the view that animals breathe for the sake of the innate heat. For both the right amount of fanning and moderate cooling are needed, as they are both seen to strengthen the inner heat, and motion is necessary for emptying out the smokiness, as one might say, from the combustion of blood." Crucially, Galen admits that the credence, pistis, of these conclusions is not scientific, and their demonstration, apodeixis, not necessary. Nevertheless, they are not devoid of the persuasive. The expression epistemonicae pistis, scientific credence, is rare, not only in Galen, but in the ancient Greek literature in general. However, it is found in the so-called Eighth Stromatos, or Liber Logicus, by Clement of Alexandria, a text which probably largely draws on Galen's own demonstration. There, demonstration is defined as, a quote, "an argument that furnishes credence, pistis, from something agreed to something disputed." However, there are two sorts of demonstration and credence, the text explains. Demonstration in the proper sense, which, a quote, "inserts scientific credence, epistemonic and pistin, into the souls of students," and the one based on opinion, doxastike. Whereas the first sort of demonstration produces scientific knowledge, episteme, the second produces only persuasion, peitho. This distinction seems to correspond to the one in the use of breathing between the necessary argument producing scientific credence and the one which is not necessary but not devoid of the pithanon. So what do these two cases tell us about the nature and use of persuasive arguments in Galen's physiology? We have seen that in his discussion of glandular helpers, Galen mentions two persuasive arguments about this issue, one of them being false and the other at least not refuted. The false one is based on the premise that channels opening into the same place carry the same use. Galen does not hesitate to call it a demonstration, yet he points out that it leads to a conflict with other demonstrations, leading to an equally persuasive but contrary conclusion. The other persuasive argument, provisionally accepted by Galen, is based on observations regarding other glands than glandular helpers themselves. Crucially, both arguments are based on a generalization from other similar cases, not on the investigation of the case in question itself. We may describe them as arguments from induction. Likewise, the persuasive argument in the use of breathing is characterized by taking its premises from sources external to the subject matter of inquiry. Taking as its starting point the vague idea that we breathe in order to preserve the inner heat, it supports this view not by exploring the causal connection between breath and heat in the body, but by way of an analogy. The properly scientific argument, on the one hand, deficient as it might seem from our point of view, does explore the connection from the subject matter itself by considering the properties of breath in informative circumstances and by isolating the cause of immediate death in suffocation. Scientific arguments are, of course, largely superior in Galen's account. Nevertheless, as the two cases show, persuasive arguments also have a legitimate place in physiology, in his view, especially when a properly scientific proof is impossible or not discovered yet, but also, as in the case of breathing, when a properly scientific argument is available as well. In the latter case, the force of the persuasive argument seems to be used for didactic or rhetorical purposes.